1. The production of cement. The diagram illustrates the process by which cement is produced for use in the construction industry. Overall, it is a linear process comprising 5 main stages, which begins with the crushing of raw materials and culminates in the bagging of the final product. The process commences with limestone and clay being fed into a large crusher, where they are broken down into a fine powder. Once this powder is formed, it is then passed into a mixer. Following this, the combined powder is transferred to a rotating heater, leading to the creation of a heated mixture. The subsequent stage involves the heated mixture being moved into a grinder. After this, the material undergoes a thorough grinding process, at which point it becomes finished cement. The process concludes when the cement is finally packaged into bags, ready for dispatch to construction sites. 2. The life cycle of a frog. The diagram illustrates the various stages in the life cycle of a frog. Overall, it is a cyclical process comprising 6 distinct stages, which begins with the laying of eggs and culminates in the development of a mature adult frog, which then reproduces. The process commences with an adult frog laying a cluster of eggs, known as frog spawn, in a body of water. Once the eggs are laid, they then develop over a period of time. Following this, an embryo grows within each egg, leading to the formation of a tadpole. The subsequent stage involves the tadpole hatching from the egg and living in the water. After this, the tadpole undergoes significant growth, at which point it develops hind legs and then front legs. The process concludes when the tadpole transforms into a young frog, loses its tail, and finally matures into an adult frog capable of laying its own eggs. 3. How bricks are made for the building industry. The diagram illustrates the process by which bricks are manufactured for the building industry. Overall, it is a linear process comprising 7 distinct stages, which begins with the excavation of clay and culminates in the delivery of the finished bricks. The process commences with clay being excavated from the ground by a large digger. Once the clay has been gathered, it is then placed on a metal grid to be broken into smaller pieces. Following this, the clay travels along a conveyor belt to a roller machine, leading to the creation of a fine, consistent material. The subsequent stage involves mixing this clay with sand and water. After this, the mixture is shaped into bricks using either a mold or a wire cutter, at which point the new bricks are placed in a drying oven for 24 to 48 hours. The process concludes when the dried bricks are fired in a kiln at high temperatures and finally packaged for delivery. 4. The recycling of glass bottles. The diagram illustrates the process by which used glass bottles are recycled. Overall, it is a cyclical process comprising 3 main stages, which begins with the collection of used bottles and culminates in the production of new products, with the cycle potentially repeating. The process commences with customers taking their used glass bottles to collection points, such as bottle banks. Once the bottles are collected, they are then transported to a cleaning plant. Following this, the glass is washed at high pressure to remove any impurities, leading to clean, sorted glass. The subsequent stage involves crushing this clean glass into small pieces in a recycling plant. After this, the crushed glass is melted in a furnace at approximately 600 degrees Celsius, at which point it becomes molten liquid glass. The process concludes when this liquid glass is combined with new liquid glass and molded into new products, such as bottles, ready to be sold again. 5. The production of chocolate. The diagram illustrates the various stages involved in the production of chocolate from cacao beans. Overall, it is a linear process comprising 10 distinct stages, which begins with the harvesting of cacao pods and culminates in the creation of finished chocolate bars. The process commences with the ripe red pods being harvested from cacao trees, which are primarily grown in South America, Africa, and Indonesia. Once harvested, the white cacao beans inside are removed and fermented. Following this, the fermented beans are spread out in the sun to dry, leading to large sacks of dried beans. The subsequent stage involves transporting these sacks to a factory. After this, the beans are roasted at a high temperature, at which point they are crushed and their outer shell is removed. The process concludes when the inner part of the bean is pressed, creating liquid chocolate which is then used to produce the final product. 6. The life cycle of a butterfly. The diagram illustrates the four main stages in the life cycle of a butterfly. Overall, it is a cyclical process comprising four distinct stages, which begins with an egg and culminates in the emergence of an adult butterfly that can reproduce. The process commences with an adult butterfly laying its eggs on a leaf or stem of a plant. Once the eggs are laid, they remain there for a period of time. Following this, a larva, more commonly known as a caterpillar, hatches from the egg, at which point its primary function is to eat and grow. The subsequent stage involves the fully grown caterpillar transforming into a pupa, also known as a chrysalis. After this, the pupa remains stationary, often attached to a twig, as it undergoes a remarkable transformation. The process concludes when an adult butterfly emerges from the chrysalis, and after its wings have dried, it is able to fly and lay its own eggs, thus beginning the cycle anew. 7. How tea is produced. The diagram illustrates the 5 main stages in the production of black tea. Overall, it is a linear process comprising 5 distinct stages, which begins with the picking of fresh tea leaves and culminates in the creation of the final dried tea product. The process commences with the fresh, young leaves being carefully picked from tea plants. Once enough leaves have been gathered, they are then laid out on racks and air is passed through them in a stage known as withering. Following this, the withered leaves are rolled and twisted, leading to the breaking of the leaf cells. The subsequent stage involves spreading these rolled leaves on a flat surface to oxidize, which allows them to develop their characteristic flavor and color. After this, the leaves are fired in an oven to stop the oxidation process, at which point they become dried tea. The process concludes when the dried tea is ready for packaging and sale. 8. The water cycle. The diagram illustrates the natural process of the water cycle. Overall, it is a continuous cyclical process comprising 3 main phases, which involves the movement of water from the Earth's surface to the atmosphere and back again. The process commences with evaporation, where heat from the sun causes water from oceans, lakes, and rivers to turn into water vapor and rise into the atmosphere. Once in the air, this vapor then cools and undergoes condensation. Following this, tiny water droplets form clouds, leading to the accumulation of water in the atmosphere. The subsequent stage is known as precipitation. After the clouds become saturated with water, they release it back to Earth in the form of rain, snow, or hail, at which point the water collects in rivers, lakes, and oceans. The process concludes as this surface water evaporates once more, beginning the cycle again. 9. How leather goods are manufactured. The diagram illustrates the various stages involved in the manufacturing of leather goods. Overall, it is a linear process comprising multiple stages, which begins with an animal hide and culminates in the creation of finished leather products. The process commences with the hide being dried and transported to a factory. Once at the factory, the hide is then washed in a mixture of water and lime. Following this, it is soaked in lime again and stretched flat, leading to a prepared hide ready for tanning. The subsequent stage involves soaking the hide in a solution of vegetable matter or chemicals in a process called tanning. After this, the tanned leather is polished with a roller, at which point it is transported to another factory. The process concludes when this finished leather is cut and stitched into products such as shoes, handbags, and balls. 10. The carbon cycle. The diagram illustrates the movement of carbon through the natural environment and via human activity. Overall, it is a complex cyclical process, which involves the exchange of carbon between the atmosphere, oceans, land, and living organisms. The process commences with carbon dioxide in the atmosphere being absorbed by plants through photosynthesis. Once absorbed, this carbon then becomes part of the plant. Following this, animals consume the plants, and the carbon is transferred to them, leading to carbon being stored within the biosphere. The subsequent stage involves the release of this carbon. After plants and animals die, they decompose, releasing carbon back into the soil and atmosphere, at which point some becomes fossil fuel over millions of years. Human activities, such as burning these fossil fuels, release large amounts of carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere. The process concludes cyclically as the ocean also absorbs and releases carbon dioxide, maintaining a dynamic balance. 11. How geothermal energy is used to produce electricity. The diagram illustrates the process of generating electricity using a geothermal power plant. Overall, it is a man-made process comprising 5 distinct stages, which begins with the injection of cold water deep underground and culminates in the generation of electricity. The process commences with cold water being pumped down an injection well, deep into the Earth's crust to a geothermal zone. Once the water reaches this hot rock layer, it is then heated by the Earth's natural heat. Following this, the heated water is forced back to the surface, leading to the production of high-pressure steam. The subsequent stage involves the steam being channeled to a power plant on the surface. After this, the steam is used to turn a turbine, at which point the turbine powers a generator. The process concludes when the generator produces electricity, which is then distributed to the national grid via transmission towers. 12. The life cycle of a salmon. The diagram illustrates the complex life cycle of the salmon, covering its journey from freshwater to the ocean and back. Overall, it is a cyclical process comprising 6 main stages, which begins with eggs in a river and culminates in adult salmon returning to the same river to spawn. The process commences with salmon eggs being laid in the upper reaches of a river, nestled in gravel. Once the eggs hatch, the young fish, known as fry, then spend a period of time growing in the river. Following this, they develop into a stage called smolt, leading to their migration downstream towards the ocean. The subsequent stage involves the smolts living and maturing in the saltwater environment of the ocean for several years. After they become fully grown adult salmon, they begin their migration back to their river of birth, at which point they swim upstream. The process concludes when the adult salmon reach the spawning grounds, reproduce by laying eggs, and then die, providing nutrients for the river ecosystem and starting the cycle anew. 13. How coffee is produced. The diagram illustrates the various stages involved in the production of coffee for sale. Overall, it is a linear process comprising 11 distinct stages, which begins with the picking of coffee beans and culminates in a cup of coffee being served. The process commences with coffee beans being hand-picked from plants. Once collected, these beans are then dried in the sun. Following this, the dried beans are roasted at a high temperature, leading to the development of their characteristic aroma. The subsequent stage involves grinding the roasted beans into a fine powder. After this, the ground coffee is packaged into jars, at which point it is delivered to shops to be sold. The process concludes when a customer buys the coffee, boils it with water in a pot, and serves it in a cup. 14. The process of photosynthesis. The diagram illustrates the process of photosynthesis, by which plants create their own food. Overall, it is a natural biochemical process, which begins with the absorption of basic elements and culminates in the production of glucose for energy. The process commences with the plant absorbing key inputs from its environment. Sunlight, which provides energy, is captured by the leaves. Following this, carbon dioxide is taken in from the atmosphere through small pores on the leaves. The subsequent stage involves the plant's roots drawing water up from the soil. After this, within the plant cells, specifically in the chloroplasts, the energy from the sun is used to convert the water and carbon dioxide into sugar or glucose, at which point this glucose provides energy for the plant to grow. The process concludes with a crucial byproduct, oxygen, being released back into the atmosphere. 15. How to apply for a driving license. The diagram illustrates the sequential steps a person must follow to apply for a driving license. Overall, it is a linear process comprising 6 distinct stages, which begins with an application at a center and culminates in the issuance of the new license. The process commences with the applicant going to a license center to submit an application form. Once the form is checked, the applicant must then pay the required fee. Following this, they are required to take an eye test to ensure their vision meets the legal standard, leading to a pass or fail result. The subsequent stage involves the applicant taking a written theory test. After passing this, they must then sit a practical driving test with an examiner, at which point their driving ability is assessed. The process concludes when the applicant successfully passes all tests, and their new driving license is issued to them. 16. The production of olive oil. The diagram illustrates the 7 stages involved in the commercial production of olive oil. Overall, it is a linear process, which begins with the harvesting of olives and culminates in the storage and sale of the final product. The process commences with olives being harvested from trees, often using a large rake to shake them onto a sheet on the ground. Once collected, the olives are then transported to a milling plant. Following this, they are rinsed with cold water and then crushed into a paste, including the pits, leading to a thick olive mixture. The subsequent stage involves this paste being placed into a large machine called a centrifuge or pressed to separate the oil. After this, the oil is separated from water and solids, at which point the waste solids are removed. The process concludes when the extracted olive oil is stored in tanks and later bottled for sale in shops. 17. The recycling of aluminium cans. The diagram illustrates the cycle of recycling used aluminium cans. Overall, it is a cyclical process comprising 6 main stages, which begins with the collection of used cans and culminates in the reuse of the recycled aluminium. The process commences with used cans being collected from homes and public recycling bins. Once gathered, these cans are then transported to a recycling center. Following this, they are cleaned, sorted, and compressed into large blocks, leading to prepared material ready for processing. The subsequent stage involves shredding and melting these blocks in a high-temperature furnace. After this, the molten aluminium is rolled into thin sheets, at which point it is ready for manufacturing. The process concludes when new cans are produced from these sheets, refilled and sent back to shops, allowing the cycle to begin again. 18. The life cycle of a silkworm. The diagram illustrates the 4 main stages in the life cycle of the silkworm, which is crucial for silk production. Overall, it is a cyclical process comprising 4 distinct stages, which begins with eggs laid by a moth and culminates in the emergence of a new moth. The process commences with an adult moth laying eggs on a mulberry leaf. Once the eggs hatch after about 10 days, a silkworm larva then emerges. Following this, the larva feeds exclusively on mulberry leaves, leading to significant growth over a period of 4 to 6 weeks. The subsequent stage involves the fully grown larva spinning a cocoon around itself using a single strand of silk. After spending about 2 weeks inside the cocoon as a pupa, it undergoes metamorphosis, at which point it is ready to emerge. The process concludes when an adult moth breaks out of the cocoon, ready to reproduce and start the cycle once more. 19. How electricity is generated in a coal-fired power station. The diagram illustrates the process of generating electricity from coal. Overall, it is a man-made linear process comprising several key stages, which begins with the burning of coal and culminates in the distribution of electricity to consumers. The process commences with coal being burned in a large furnace, which heats a boiler containing water. Once the water is heated, it then turns into high-pressure steam. Following this, the steam is channeled through pipes to a turbine, leading to the rapid spinning of the turbine blades. The subsequent stage involves the spinning turbine powering a generator. After this, the generator converts the mechanical energy into electrical energy, at which point the electricity is sent to a transformer to increase its voltage. The process concludes when this high-voltage electricity is transmitted across the country through a network of power lines to homes and businesses. 20. The process of glass bottle manufacturing. The diagram illustrates the main stages involved in manufacturing glass bottles. Overall, it is a linear industrial process comprising 5 key stages, which begins with raw materials in a furnace and culminates in the packaging of finished bottles. The process commences with a mixture of sand, soda ash, and limestone being heated in a glass furnace to around 1,500 degrees Celsius. Once this mixture becomes molten glass, it is then fed into a molding machine. Following this, compressed air is used to shape the molten glass inside the molds, leading to the formation of rough bottle shapes. The subsequent stage involves these newly formed bottles being moved along a conveyor belt to a machine for annealing. After this, they undergo a process of controlled cooling to strengthen the glass, at which point they are inspected for any defects. The process concludes when the quality check bottles are packaged and sent to a warehouse for distribution. 21. The life cycle of a honey bee. The diagram illustrates the 4 main stages in the life cycle of a honey bee. Overall, it is a cyclical process that takes approximately 21 days to complete, which begins with an egg and culminates in the emergence of an adult bee. The process commences with the queen bee laying a single egg in each cell of the honeycomb. Once the egg is laid, it remains in this state for about 3 days. Following this, the egg hatches into a small larva, at which point worker bees begin to feed it a substance known as royal jelly. The subsequent stage involves the larva growing rapidly and being fed bee bread, a mixture of pollen and honey. After about 9 days, the worker bees cap the cell with wax, and the larva spins a cocoon to become a pupa. The process concludes when, after another 12 days, a fully formed adult bee chews its way out of the cell, ready to perform its duties in the hive and continue the life cycle. 22. How instant noodles are made. The diagram illustrates the industrial process of manufacturing instant noodles. Overall, it is a linear process comprising 8 distinct stages, which begins with raw materials in a silo and culminates in the final packaging of the noodle cups. The process commences with flour being transported from storage silos to a mixing machine. Once in the mixer, water and oil are added, and the ingredients are then kneaded into a large sheet of dough. Following this, the dough sheet is passed through a series of rollers to be flattened and cut into thin noodle strands. The subsequent stage involves these noodle strands being steamed and then shaped into blocks. After this, the noodle blocks are deep fried to dehydrate them and then left to cool, at which point they are placed into cups. The process concludes when vegetables and spices are added to the cups, which are then sealed and labeled, ready for distribution. 23. The process of desalination. The diagram illustrates a common method of desalination, which is the process of removing salt from seawater to produce fresh drinking water. Overall, it is a man-made linear process, which begins with the intake of seawater and culminates in the distribution of fresh water to consumers. The process commences with seawater being drawn into a desalination plant through an intake pipe. Once inside, the water then undergoes a pretreatment phase where large particles and debris are filtered out. Following this, the pretreated water is forced at high pressure through a series of membranes in a process called reverse osmosis. The subsequent stage involves these membranes allowing water molecules to pass through but blocking larger salt molecules. After this separation, 2 streams are created, one of fresh, purified water and another of highly concentrated salt water, known as brine, at which point the brine is discharged back into the sea. The process concludes when the fresh water is treated with chemicals for safety and then pumped into the main water supply. 24. The life cycle of a mealworm. The diagram illustrates the 4 stages in the life cycle of a mealworm beetle. Overall, it is a cyclical process of complete metamorphosis, which begins with an egg and culminates in an adult beetle capable of reproduction. The process commences with an adult female beetle laying hundreds of tiny, white eggs. Once the eggs hatch after about 1 to 2 weeks, a small larva, known as a mealworm, then emerges. Following this, the mealworm spends several months eating and growing, shedding its exoskeleton multiple times. The subsequent stage involves the fully grown mealworm transforming into a pupa. After this pupation stage, which lasts for another 1 to 3 weeks, the pupa remains largely inactive while it develops into its adult form. The process concludes when an adult beetle emerges from the pupal case, ready to mate and lay eggs, thus restarting the cycle. 25. How hydroelectric power is generated. The diagram illustrates the process of generating electricity using a hydroelectric dam. Overall, it is a man-made process that converts the potential energy of stored water into electricity, which begins with a reservoir and culminates in power transmission. The process commences with a large dam being built across a river to create a reservoir of water. Once the reservoir is full, the water flows through an intake gate in the dam. Following this, the water travels down a large pipe called a penstock, leading to a significant increase in its pressure and speed. The subsequent stage involves this high-pressure water striking the blades of a large turbine, causing it to spin rapidly. After this, the spinning turbine is connected to a generator, at which point the generator converts the mechanical motion into electrical energy. The process concludes when this electricity is sent to a transformer and then transmitted to consumers via power lines. 26. The production of smoked fish. The diagram illustrates the process of preserving fish through smoking. Overall, It is a linear process involving several key stages, which begins with catching fresh fish and culminates in the final product being dispatched to shops. The process commences with fresh fish being caught and transported to a processing facility. Once the fish arrive, they are then cleaned, gutted, and cut open. Following this, the fish are soaked in a saltwater brine for a period of time, leading to the initial preservation and flavoring. The subsequent stage involves hanging the brined fish on racks in a smokehouse. After this, a slow-burning wood fire is used to expose the fish to smoke for several hours, at which point they are cooked and infused with a smoky flavor. The process concludes when the smoked fish are cooled, packaged, and then delivered to retail outlets for sale. 27. How sugar is produced from sugar cane. The diagram illustrates the manufacturing process of producing sugar from sugar cane plants. Overall, it is a linear industrial process with 7 main stages, which begins with the growing of sugar cane and culminates in the drying and cooling of sugar crystals. The process commences with sugar cane being grown in fields for 12 to 18 months before being harvested. Once harvested, the canes are then put through a crushing machine to extract the juice. Following this, the juice is passed through a limestone filter to purify it, leading to a cleaner liquid. The subsequent stage involves heating this juice in an evaporator until it thickens into a syrup. After this, the syrup is placed in a centrifuge to separate the sugar crystals from the remaining liquid, at which point the raw sugar crystals are formed. The process concludes when these crystals are dried and cooled, ready for consumption. 28. The life cycle of a chicken. The diagram illustrates the 4 main stages in the life cycle of a chicken. Overall, it is a cyclical process of reproduction and growth, which begins with an adult hen laying eggs and culminates in the development of a mature chicken. The process commences with an adult hen laying eggs, which are then incubated for a period of 21 days. Once the incubation period is complete, a chick then hatches from the egg. Following this, the young chick grows and develops its feathers over several months, leading to its maturation into an adult. The subsequent stage involves the adult chicken reaching reproductive age. After a few more months, the mature hen is capable of laying its own eggs, at which point the cycle can begin again. The process concludes as the chicken continues its life, either laying more eggs or being used for meat. 29. How a hot air balloon works. The diagram illustrates the principles of how a hot air balloon operates. Overall, it is a process based on basic physics, which begins with heating the air inside the balloon and culminates in controlled flight and landing. The process commences with the balloon, or envelope, being spread out on the ground and partially inflated with cold air from a fan. Once it is partially full, a propane burner is then used to heat the air inside. Following this, the heated air expands and becomes less dense than the cooler air outside, leading to the balloon rising off the ground. The subsequent stage involves the pilot controlling the altitude of the balloon. After reaching the desired height, the pilot uses short bursts from the burner to maintain it, at which point the balloon travels with the wind. The process concludes when the pilot allows the air to cool, or releases hot air through a vent, causing the balloon to descend for a gentle landing. 30. The production of canned fish. The diagram illustrates the industrial process of canning fish. Overall, it is a linear process comprising multiple stages, which begins with catching the fish and culminates in the final product being dispatched for sale. The process commences with fresh fish being caught at sea and delivered to a cannery. Once the fish arrive, they are then frozen and thawed before being prepared. Following this, they are salted, steamed, and the heads and tails are removed, leading to prepared fish fillets. The subsequent stage involves placing these fillets into open cans. After this, sauces like oil or tomato sauce are added, and the cans are sealed, at which point they are sterilized in a high-pressure cooker. The process concludes when the sterilized cans are labeled, stored in a warehouse, and finally dispatched to supermarkets. 31. The life cycle of a ladybug. The diagram illustrates the 4 stages in the life cycle of a ladybug. Overall, it is a cyclical process of complete metamorphosis, which begins with an egg and culminates in an adult ladybug that can reproduce. The process commences with an adult ladybug laying a cluster of yellow eggs on the underside of a leaf, usually near an aphid colony. Once the eggs hatch after a few days, a small alligator-like larva then emerges. Following this, the larva spends several weeks eating hundreds of aphids, leading to rapid growth. The subsequent stage involves the fully grown larva attaching itself to a leaf and entering the pupal stage. After about a week, the pupa undergoes a transformation, at which point its adult structures are formed. The process concludes when a familiar-looking adult ladybug emerges from the pupal case, ready to eat, fly, and lay its own eggs. 32. How a solar panel generates electricity for a home. The diagram illustrates the process by which a domestic solar panel system provides electricity. Overall, it is a man-made process that converts sunlight into usable electricity for a home, which begins with solar radiation hitting the panels and culminates in powering household appliances. The process commences with sunlight, composed of photons, striking the photovoltaic cells of the solar panels installed on a roof. Once the photons hit the cells, they then create a flow of direct current, DC, electricity. Following this DC electricity is channeled from the panels to an inverter. The subsequent stage involves the inverter converting the DC electricity into alternating current, AC, electricity, which is the standard type used in homes. After this, the AC electricity flows to the home's fuse box, at which point it is distributed to power lights and appliances. The process concludes as any excess electricity generated is either stored in a battery or exported back to the national grid. 33. The process of making recycled paper. The diagram illustrates how waste paper is recycled into new paper. Overall, it is a linear process with several distinct stages, which begins with the collection of waste paper and culminates in the production of new paper rolls. The process commences with waste paper being collected and transported to a paper mill. Once at the mill, the paper is then cleaned to remove items like staples and plastic. Following this, it is mixed with water and chemicals in a large vat, leading to the creation of a pulp. The subsequent stage involves cleaning, filtering, and de-inking this pulp to remove any remaining impurities and ink. After this, the cleaned pulp is fed into a paper machine, at which point it is sprayed onto a large mesh screen and the water is drained away. The process concludes when the resulting sheet is heated and pressed by rollers to form a finished roll of recycled paper. 34. The life cycle of a mosquito. The diagram illustrates the 4 distinct stages in the life cycle of a mosquito. Overall, it is a cyclical process with the initial stages taking place in water, which begins with an egg and culminates in a flying adult mosquito. The process commences with an adult female mosquito laying her eggs on the surface of still water. Once the eggs hatch, typically within 48 hours, a larva, or wiggler, then emerges. Following this, the larva lives in the water, feeding on microorganisms and breathing through a siphon tube at the surface. The subsequent stage involves the larva developing into a pupa, or tumbler. After a few days in this non-feeding stage, the pupa undergoes its final transformation, at which point the adult mosquito develops inside. The process concludes when the pupal case splits open and the fully formed adult mosquito emerges onto the water's surface, ready to fly away and, in the case of females, seek a blood meal to begin the cycle again. 35. How a simple camera works. The diagram illustrates the basic process of how a traditional film camera captures an image. Overall, it is a process based on the principles of light and optics, which begins with light entering the lens and culminates in an image being recorded on film. The process commences with light from a subject passing through the camera's lens. Once the light enters, the lens then focuses it into a coherent beam. Following this, the light passes through an aperture, which controls the amount of light allowed in. The subsequent stage involves the camera's shutter opening for a fraction of a second. After the shutter opens, the focus light is projected onto a piece of light-sensitive film at the back of the camera, at which point a chemical reaction occurs on the film surface, creating a latent image. The process concludes when the shutter closes, and the film is advanced, ready for the next photograph to be taken. 36. The production of maple syrup. The diagram illustrates the process of making maple syrup from the sap of maple trees. Overall, it is a seasonal, linear process, which begins with tapping maple trees in the early spring and culminates in the final bottled syrup. The process commences with a hole being drilled into a maple tree and a tap, or spile, being inserted. Once the tap is in place, the clear, watery sap then drips out and is collected in a bucket. Following this, the collected sap is transported to a sugar house. The subsequent stage involves pouring the sap into a large evaporator pan. After this, the sap is boiled for a long time to evaporate most of the water, at which point it thickens and becomes concentrated syrup. The process concludes when the syrup is filtered to remove any impurities and then bottled while it is still hot, ready for consumption. 37. The life cycle of a star like our Sun. The diagram illustrates the life cycle of an average-sized star, such as the Sun. Overall, it is a process that spans billions of years, which begins with a nebula and culminates in the formation of a black dwarf. The process commences with a vast cloud of gas and dust known as a nebula. Once gravity causes this cloud to collapse, it then forms a hot, dense core called a protostar. Following this, the core becomes hot enough for nuclear fusion to begin, leading to the birth of a main sequence star. The subsequent stage involves the star spending most of its life in this stable phase. After billions of years, it runs out of hydrogen fuel and expands into a red giant, at which point its outer layers drift away, forming a planetary nebula. The process concludes when the remaining core collapses into a dense white dwarf, which eventually cools over an immense timescale to become a cold, dark black dwarf. 38. How tidal power is generated. The diagram illustrates the generation of electricity using a tidal barrage. Overall, it is a cyclical process that harnesses the power of the tides, which begins with the incoming tide filling a basin and culminates in the generation of electricity. The process commences with a large dam, or barrage, being built across an estuary. Once the tide comes in, sluice gates in the barrage are opened, allowing the basin behind it to fill with water. Following this, the gates are closed, trapping the water at high tide. The subsequent stage involves waiting for the tide on the seaward side to fall. After a sufficient height difference is created, the water from the basin is released through turbines embedded in the barrage, at which point the force of the water spins the turbines. The process concludes when these turbines drive generators to produce electricity, a process that can be repeated when the tide comes in and out. 39. The process of mummification in ancient Egypt. The diagram illustrates the ancient Egyptian process of mummification. Overall, it is a complex, ritualistic process with many steps, which begins with the removal of internal organs and culminates in the final wrapping of the body. The process commences with the body being washed and the brain being removed through the nose using a hook. Once this is done, an incision is then made on the left side of the body to remove the internal organs like the liver, lungs, and intestines. Following this, these organs are dried and placed in special canopic jars. The subsequent stage involves covering the body completely with natron salt for about 40 days to remove all moisture. After the body is fully dehydrated, it is cleaned and stuffed with linen to retain its shape, at which point it is coated with resin. The process concludes when the body is wrapped tightly in hundreds of yards of linen bandages, with amulets placed between the layers, before being placed in a sarcophagus. 40. How a nuclear power plant generates electricity. The diagram illustrates the process of generating electricity in a typical nuclear power plant. Overall, it is a man-made process that uses nuclear fission, which begins with a reaction in the reactor core and culminates in the production of electricity. The process commences with nuclear fission being initiated in the reactor core, where uranium atoms are split, releasing a huge amount of heat. Once this heat is generated, it is then used to heat water in a primary circuit, turning it into high-pressure steam. Following this steam is used to heat a separate, secondary circuit of water. The subsequent stage involves the steam from the secondary circuit being channeled to a turbine. After this, the force of the steam spins the turbine at high speed, at which point the turbine drives a generator to produce electricity. The process concludes when the steam is cooled back into water in a cooling tower and recycled, while the electricity is sent to the national grid. 41. The life cycle of a jellyfish. The diagram illustrates the complex life cycle of a jellyfish. Overall, it is a cyclical process involving both sexual and asexual reproduction, which begins with an adult jellyfish releasing gametes and culminates in the development of a new adult. The process commences with adult male and female jellyfish releasing sperm and eggs into the water. Once fertilization occurs, a larva called a planula then develops. Following this, the planula swims and attaches itself to a hard surface, like a rock or the seabed. The subsequent stage involves the planula transforming into a stationary polyp. After a period of growth, this polyp begins to reproduce asexually by budding, creating a stack of tiny, immature jellyfish called ephyrae, at which point these ephyrae break away from the polyp. The process concludes when each ephyra grows and matures into an adult jellyfish, or medusa, ready to start the cycle again. 42. How a book is published. The diagram illustrates the main stages of the book publishing process. Overall, it is a linear process involving multiple stakeholders, which begins with an author writing a manuscript and culminates in the book being sold to the public. The process commences with an author writing a manuscript and submitting it to a publishing house, often via a literary agent. Once the manuscript is accepted, the author and publisher then sign a contract. Following this, the manuscript undergoes extensive editing for content, grammar, and style. The subsequent stage involves the design of the book's cover and interior layout. After the design is finalized, the book is printed and bound, at which point copies are sent to a warehouse for storage. The process concludes when the publisher's marketing and sales teams promote the book, and it is distributed to bookstores and online retailers for sale to customers. 43. The process of brewing beer. The diagram illustrates the traditional process of brewing beer. Overall, it is a linear process with several distinct stages, which begins with the milling of malt and culminates in the final packaging of the beer. The process commences with malted barley being milled or crushed to break open the grains. Once crushed, the grains are then mixed with hot water in a vessel called a mash tun. Following this, the mixture is left to steep, leading to the conversion of starches into fermentable sugars, creating a sweet liquid called wort. The subsequent stage involves separating the wort from the grain solids and boiling it in a kettle, during which hops are added for bitterness and aroma. After boiling, the wort is cooled rapidly and transferred to a fermentation tank, at which point yeast is added. The process concludes when the yeast ferments the sugars into alcohol and carbon dioxide over a period of weeks, and the resulting beer is then matured and packaged into bottles, cans, or kegs. 44. The life cycle of a fern. The diagram illustrates the two-generation life cycle of a fern, known as alternation of generations. Overall, it is a cyclical process involving both a large, familiar plant and a tiny, lesser-known one, which begins with spores and culminates in the growth of a new spore-producing fern. The process commences with a mature fern plant, called a sporophyte, releasing tiny spores from the underside of its fronds. Once a spore lands on moist soil, it then germinates and grows into a small, heart-shaped plant called a gametophyte. Following this plant produces both male and female sex cells. The subsequent stage involves fertilization occurring, usually requiring water for the male cells to swim to the female cells. After fertilization, a new sporophyte begins to grow from the gametophyte, at which point it develops roots, a stem, and its first fronds. The process concludes when the sporophyte matures into a large fern, and the small gametophyte withers away, with the new adult plant ready to produce its own spores. 45. How crude oil is processed. Fractional distillation. The diagram illustrates the process of fractional distillation, which is used to refine crude oil into useful products. Overall, it is a linear industrial process, which begins with heating crude oil and culminates in the separation of various hydrocarbon fractions. The process commences with crude oil being pumped from a storage tank and heated in a high-temperature furnace to about 400 degrees Celsius. Once heated, the mixture of liquid and vapor then enters the bottom of a tall fractionating column. Following this, the hot vapor rises up the column. The subsequent stage involves the column having a temperature gradient, being very hot at the bottom and gradually cooler towards the top. After the vapor rises, different fractions condense into liquids at different temperatures on trays at various levels, at which point they are collected. The process concludes when heavier fractions with high boiling points, like bitumen and fuel oil, are collected at the bottom, while lighter fractions with low boiling points, like petrol and gas, are collected at the top. 46. The process of making potato crisps. The diagram illustrates the industrial process of manufacturing potato crisps. Overall, it is a linear process with several automated stages, which begins with whole potatoes and culminates in the final bagged product. The process commences with fresh potatoes being delivered to the factory and placed in a quality inspection machine. Once approved, they are then washed and peeled by a peeling machine. Following this, the peeled potatoes are moved along a conveyor belt into a slicer, leading to thin, uniform slices. The subsequent stage involves washing these slices to remove excess starch and then drying them. After this, the dried slices are deep-fried in hot oil at a high temperature, at which point they become crispy. The process concludes when the crisps are salted or flavored, inspected one last time, and then weighed and sealed into bags by a packaging machine. 47. The life cycle of a housefly. The diagram illustrates the 4 main stages in the life cycle of a common housefly. Overall, it is a rapid cyclical process, often completed in just a few weeks, which begins with an egg and culminates in a mature, flying adult. The process commences with a female housefly laying a batch of up to 150 eggs in decaying organic matter, such as garbage or manure. Once the eggs are laid, they hatch into larvae known as maggots in as little as 8 hours. Following this, the maggots feed voraciously on the surrounding material, leading to rapid growth over several days. The subsequent stage involves the fully grown maggot moving to a dry, dark location to pupate. After it forms a hard, reddish-brown pupal case, it remains inside for 3 to 6 days, at which point it undergoes a complete metamorphosis. The process concludes when an adult fly emerges from the pupa, ready to feed, mate, and reproduce within a few days, starting the cycle again. 48. How wind turbines generate electricity. The diagram illustrates the process by which a wind turbine converts wind energy into electrical energy. Overall, it is a man-made process that harnesses a renewable resource, which begins with wind turning the blades and culminates in the generation of electricity. The process commences with wind blowing across the large blades of the turbine, causing them to rotate. Once the blades are spinning, they then turn a central rotor shaft. Following this low-speed shaft is connected to a gearbox, leading to an increase in the speed of rotation. The subsequent stage involves this high-speed shaft turning a generator. After this, the generator converts the kinetic energy of the rotation into electrical energy, at which point this electricity is sent down the turbine tower. The process concludes when the electricity is converted by a transformer to the correct voltage and then exported to the electricity grid. 49. The process of making smoked bacon. The diagram illustrates the traditional method for producing smoked bacon. Overall, it is a linear process involving curing and smoking, which begins with a piece of pork belly and culminates in the final packaged product. The process commences with a fresh piece of pork belly being trimmed. Once trimmed, it is then thoroughly coated in a curing mixture of salt, sugar, and spices. Following this, the pork is placed in a cool, dark place to cure for about a week, leading to the removal of moisture and the start of preservation. The subsequent stage involves rinsing the excess cure off the pork and allowing it to dry. After this, the cured pork is hung in a smokehouse, at which point it is slowly smoked over smoldering wood chips for several hours or days. The process concludes when the bacon has absorbed the desired smoky flavor, and it is then cooled, sliced, and packaged for sale. 50. The life cycle of a plastic bottle. The diagram illustrates the typical life cycle of a plastic bottle, from production to disposal or recycling. Overall, it is a process with 2 potential outcomes, which begins with the manufacturing of the bottle and culminates in either it becoming waste or being recycled. The process commences with the manufacturing of new plastic bottles from raw materials like oil. Once the bottles are made, they are then filled with a product such as water or a soft drink and transported to shops. Following this, consumers purchase and use the bottles. The subsequent stage involves the disposal of the empty bottle. After use, the bottle can either be thrown away, at which point it ends up in a landfill where it takes hundreds of years to decompose, or it can be placed in a recycling bin. If recycled, the process concludes when the bottle is taken to a plant, cleaned, shredded into plastic pellets, and used to manufacture new plastic goods, potentially starting a new cycle.